Hello, welcome again to Sport Unlocked, going through the week's sports news. And we Rob Harris from Sky News, Martyn Ziegler from the Times, and Tariq Panja from the New York Times. And a special hello to our listeners around the world, including in India, where we're 38th this week in the Apple Sports Pod chart.
Well, I've got a big family in India as well, so thank you for propping us up in India. Hello, everyone.
Well, yes, I also may have some relatives in India from my great grandfather is actually buried was in India before partition and just after the First World War, caught influenza and sadly died and is buried in Karachi. So maybe there's some links there driving us up the pod charts.
Remarkable story there, Zeke. So maybe an away day to Karachi for Sport Unlocked in the future.
Yeah, well, we should do that. Go and track down his grave. We can do a special overseas pod from Karachi. That would be pretty good.
Perhaps big interest in India because we talked about Seb Coe last week and we had him featured on the pod as well.
Seb Coe, I think his mother was from India, wasn't? I think, if I'm not mistaken, and he often speaks quite proudly about that. And so. Maybe all these things are making us very, very popular, and we didn't even really talk about cricket.
Excellent finish there to the inaugural women's IPL. Big crowds, really competitive games, high-level cricket, and now we've got the start of the men's tournament, which is pound for pound the most expensive sports rights of any event barring the NFL. So cricket going gangbusters in India, as you'd expect, maybe, but maybe not at the level that we would have thought in 2008 when the first IPL started. Those franchises went for $80 million. They're now worth about $1 billion each. It's an incredible success story, isn't it?
Yeah, we're seeing the growth of the women's competition. It was the Mumbai Indians who beat the Delhi Capitals in the final of that.
It's a really big thing, actually, for women's cricket. I was at Yorkshire Cricket Club this week, just speaking to people down Gough ahead of the ECB sanctions over the racism case, and actually also there were two of the Yorkshire women's players, and they were just talking about what a impact the women's Indian Premier League has had on the whole sport, and they think it's really just driving everything. It's really, really big.
Well, one of the big meetings of the week was the IOC's executive board, and we've been hearing from Thomas Bach, and the big decision was really over the future of Russian and Belarusian athletes at the Olympics, and they never took a decision. Instead, we had the IOC giving this sort of general recommendation to all other sports to only allow Russians in as neutrals, also only if the Russian and Belarusian athletes haven't actually been part of the war in Ukraine. But they did stall on this decision over the Paris Olympics without any reason necessarily why they aren't just deciding now. And Tariq, you asked Thomas Bach, didn't you, if they're just sort of kicking the can down the road, weren't they?
Yeah, it was interesting. So what they decided was to recommend that all the international federations, the sports that make up the Olympics, they recommended they actually find a way for Russian and Belarusian athletes as individuals to compete, not as teams, and providing they're not in the military, essentially creating a runway for them to get to the Olympics. Martyn, to me it seems the IOC are desperate for Russia and Belarus to be in the Olympics. They've now laid the groundwork for them to qualify, and as the event draws nearer, they'll say, right, we've decided they're going to be in. Is that the sense you got? You're on the course.
It certainly looked like they're paving the way. They've said individual athletes should be able to compete, but not teams. I mean, so that they didn't go quite as far as I was expecting. I thought they would say, if anyone who was neutral could take part, but they've just recommended the individuals at the moment. So whether that changes, we will see. But yeah, it's definitely, it looks like the direction of travel is to make sure that Russians are going to be there. But I'm not quite sure why he's doing it. Well, Thomas Bach and the IOC, why they're so sort of keen to do it. World Athletics, swimming have both said they're not allowing Russian individuals to compete. I'm not quite sure it's a good interesting to know why they're doing it, because nothing's actually changed in terms of the war, is it? So it's that's an intriguing aspect for me.
Nothing's changed, maybe even worse since the invasion. We've seen UN reports declaring war crimes have taken place in Ukraine at the hands of Russian soldiers. So it's in a way worse. There was a Ukrainian journalist, Martyn, who asked Thomas Park that very question. So he said, well, if you had recommended that no Russian athletes, whether individuals or teams or anything else, be barred from sports a year ago in the aftermath of the invasion, what's actually changed? And Thomas Park gave two answers. One, he said, in the years since he's seen sports with individual Russians take place, he cited tennis as the main example where Russians are competing around the world and able to travel. And then he gave this other point, the second point, Martyn, and you were quite interested in this. These recommendations from the two UN special rapporteurs that the IOC has turned to. And he said it would be a breach of these Belarusian and Russian passport holders' human rights if they're not allowed to compete in the Olympics. But one of them has gone even further, hasn't she?
Yeah, she said that anyone, even if you're in the Russian military, then you should be allowed to take part. Only if you've been found guilty of war crimes should that stop you competing. But the arguments you use for allowing individual Russians to take part are just the same as you could use for allowing teams to take part. It just seems it's illogical, and but it seems like it's opening the door to me. I mean, personally, I don't think Russians should be there at all, and I think World Athletics and swimming have gone a long way to sort of blocking the IOC's attempts to allow this to happen. So well done them, and let's see what happens with the teams.
I do see an issue that the IOC were really tough a year ago when they had none of their own Olympics coming up, sort of issuing that order for no Russians at all in any sport. Now we're close to Paris. Obviously, they've weakened their position. And when we hear from Thomas Barr saying, if we were to allow politicians to dictate our decision making, a reference to the calls from various governments, countries around,
35.
that Russians and Belarusian athletes would be banned completely. He says it would be destroying sport if the politicians dictate things. But then at the same time, he's sort of backing up all his decision making and saying, well, that's what the UN rapporteur is recommending.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing here is that this leeway under Thomas Bach has been granted to Russia prior to this legal invasion, right? Think about the doping scandals and then attempt to cover up the doping scandals. The IOC has bent over backwards to allow Russian athletes in Russia to participate in games, even though they've been perhaps the worst actors in terms of corrupting sport prior to the war. And this is, again, feels like more of the same. Martyn, you asked Thomas Bach a question. It seemed to rattle him a little bit. What did you ask him?
Well, I just pointed out the fact that the first person who rang him to congratulate him when Thomas Bach was elected in 2013 was Vladimir Putin. And they enjoyed a sort of fairly close relationship after that, went to the Sochi Olympics in 2014. And then Putin was given the Olympic order, but he did seem a bit irritated with the question, Thomas Bach, didn't he? And sort of snapped back that Putin was the first person that the Olympic order has ever been removed from. So that seemed to justify his the fact that I think he was saying his relationship with Putin no longer existed, and they hadn't spoken for the last year.
And he did directly criticise Russia over the invasion, which perhaps compares to the FIFA stance where they've talked about the Russia-Ukraine war, implying there were two sides, Gianni Infantino calling for a ceasefire rather than directly calling for Russia to withdraw from territory. And another point of Thomas Bach's comments we discussed, he said, the Olympic Games can't prevent wars and conflicts. This is the realm of politics. But we do have this big deal made out of the Olympic truce every 2 years at the Olympics.
Yeah, funny enough, he said the reason they were so condemnatory and where they demanded that Russian athletes be barred a year ago was that the invasion took place at the same time as the Winter Olympics, when there's supposed to be an Olympic truce. I don't know how many countries sign up to this, or whether it's a real thing. He seemed to be very exercised by the idea that you could invade a country during the Olympic Games, and that's what he said. Why they did that. Again, I mean, does it matter when you invade someone? It's just, even after the Olympics, it's pretty horrific, isn't it?
Absolutely. You mentioned the sort of difference with FIFA and the IOC. You're right. I was actually surprised that Thomas Bach, that he was actually quite sort of, the language he used was condemnatory of Russia. Has Gianni Infantino, the FIFA president, has he returned his medal that Putin gave him after the Russia World Cup?
It was the friendship medal that I asked him about the day the full-scale invasion was launched, actually, in February 2022. No response there, no response since in terms of whether he did. And it was obviously notable because in 2018, when the World Cup was in Russia, at that point, we knew Russia had annexed Ukraine, had taken Ukrainian territory, and yet, of course, there he was in Russia talking about being on the same team as the Russian leadership as well. And even actually, of course, in 2014, the original annexation of Crimea, Russian troops by proxy at the time going into the Donbass in eastern Ukraine. That was between the Olympics and the Paralympics, when we had a celebration of sport, and of course a lot of very annoyed Ukrainian athletes who made their positions known against Russia while on the podiums at the Paralympics.
Yeah, not to forget the issue with Georgia in 2008, Abkhazia. Was around the time of the Beijing Olympics. Anyway, stop being so mean to Gianni.
Well, this week Gianni Infantino was actually in Budapest at the European Club Association meeting. All their part of the FIFA delegation with an agreement. All the squabbling over the period, over the new expansion of the Club World Cup and over the player release for future men's World Cups. Well, actually, there is now that agreement. And why does all this matter? Well, for the men's World Cup, officially, clubs could refuse to release their players for international fixtures if they didn't have this agreement between the ECA and FIFA. And we have the numbers, and an increase of 70% on what clubs got to share from the 2022 World Cup agreed for the 2026 World Cup. It's $355 million they'll split, but at the same time, the World Cup's expanding from 32 to 48 teams.
Yeah, and also Gianni Infantino gave us the budget for that World Cup, and he said it will generate at least $11 billion. So, the increase makes sense, and in a way, if you were going to prorate it, perhaps it would have been even more. And that's also not counting prize money. That's almost a $1 billion that FIFA will give to participants, either the clubs releasing the players or in prize money for the men's World Cup.
So the way it's worked out, they are paid basically sort of almost for every match or every day that a player is involved. And we're seeing so it's a 75% rise in the money, but there's a 62% rise in the number of matches, going up from 64 to 104. There's going to be, there's going to be, I think, a week longer. The World Cup's going to be a week longer, isn't it? So I think it's. I don't think it's sort of almost a pro rata increase. I wouldn't say it's a huge victory for the clubs.
No, and this MOU, it was quite sticky. It was supposed to have been signed in Qatar and Doha. The ECA board and a bunch of other people have flown over to that posh hotel people were based in, expecting to sign the MOU, and it wasn't done there. So it's been a bit of a thorny issue. Rob mentioned this idea of maybe not calling it prize money and pushing it into this other area. But I think the words prize money are going to change in the future anyway. Gianni Infantino in Kigali after his coronation a couple of weeks ago suggested as much to me when we asked him if this increase in women's prize money will be going directly to the women who are participating in the tournament or to the women's game. And he said there's going to be some limits actually on the amount that the actual participants get, and he'd like a different word than prize money for this because it's confusing the issue.
the European clubs had been opposing this, but now suddenly Nasser Al Khelaifi, the PSG boss who runs the ECA, saying how excellent the idea is. They're all on board with it.
They're going to set up a joint venture, a bit like the Champions League, aren't they? So that the clubs will sort of have a big say in the commercial rights, the broadcast rights, sponsorship. Um, Nasser Al Khelaifi, he did insist that this wasn't just going to benefit the 12 European clubs taking part in it, that the money was going to trickle down in a big way to the rest of the clubs. But we wait to see exactly how that works out. I can't see the likes of Real Madrid giving up a big chunk of the cash to the rest of football, can you?
No, and this is a 4-yearly tournament, and this question of distribution is really, really important, particularly outside of Europe, because you will have teams from the other confederations who will never have earned this much money, probably, right? This one-off payment for participating in this tournament, which estimates to be worth 1 to 2 billion to FIFA, and then the tens of millions to the teams. So when they go back to their home countries, to the league champions, their coffers will be full compared to their rivals, and then we risk seeing the same kind of teams pull away that compete in this event, like the ones in the Champions League in their domestic competitions. So I'd love to see how they're going to get this formula right.
Yeah, in terms of that competitive balance. But for the tournament itself, you can well see a situation where clubs are actually embracing going to a meaningful competitive tournament, unlike the pre-season events that take place currently.
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic tournament, to be honest with you. I take away with this caveat that there's too much football, players are tired, the calendar's packed. If all of this other kind of important stuff can be fixed, the idea of a world championship for clubs that is meaningful for fans around the world to go and attend, I think it's quite a good idea. Because look at the biggest clubs in the world. Like, I don't know, we saw Manchester United's earnings. We'll talk about them maybe a bit later, but they've got fans in places like Indonesia and Malaysia and India, wherever, in South America, who might not get to see their team, but then they all get together for 1 month of the football tournament. I think it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, I think it could be good, if it brings up the level of other clubs outside of Europe. Then I think it could be a good thing. Chelsea are already there, of course, as the Champions League winners, and they put out some details from their annual accounts this week, and it looks like they're going to be next year at least. They're going to be in some pretty serious risk of breaching Premier League profit and sustainability rules. We've already seen Everton have been charged last week with that, and then the Chelsea's annual losses last season 121 million. That's the year before was 153 million. So if this season is another significant loss, and I think it probably will be because they're not doing particularly well on the pitch, then I think they're going to be in big trouble unless they sell a load of players this summer and before June the 30th.
The Premier League allowing losses of £105 million over 3 years for clubs. But are they laying the groundwork for a way out of this by blaming the sanctions, and will it be like a force majeure and trying to set up? How could we ever know our owner would be sanctioned for being involved or being Russian and a clampdown on Russian oligarchs?
Yeah, well, it's a massive number, and I'm sure you'll employ all sorts of lawyers and taxes. The Premier League recently have shown that they are taking action. We've seen the Man City case. Martyn just mentioned Everton. Chelsea probably, have to deal with the repercussions that come from that overspending.
You're right. I mean, they are trying to blame the sanctions for the losses. They say interfered with their sort of commercial and match day income. I mean, yes, there was a bit of ticket sales, but I think that was very, very small. But they're also going to claim that, for example, they couldn't get a transfer fee for Rudiger. He went to Real Madrid on a free transfer because they weren't allowed to sign a new contract with him. But I think that's clutching at straws. Personally, I think I think it's very, very rare, almost unheard of, for a top player not to have signed a deal and then to do so, at the end of the season. Normally, if they're going to sign a deal, they do it in the January, don't they? So I think they will be. That's a stretch to try and claim that.
There isn't a clear process always when it comes to Premier League cases, as we've seen with Newcastle United, that takeover approved by the Premier League in 2021 after they got what they called the legally binding guarantees that there wouldn't be any control from the Saudi state, without, of course, saying why it was necessary to have those guarantees, because there's no rules preventing states owning clubs. Then further down the line, Richard Masters, the Premier League chief executive, said if there was anything to revisit over the ownership, they would look into it. Then, in recent weeks, we've had a US case that's had mention of the Newcastle owners, PIF, the Public Investment Fund, where they want that case basically thrown out and for them not to be subject to the case because they are a state entity, PIF. Whereas with Newcastle, they try to insinuate they're not a state entity at all. All very confusing. And then we had Richard Masters in front of MPs asked about that this week.
Yes, he was. He was asked about that very point, and not only PIF, but also Yasser Al Rumayyan, the chairman of Newcastle and the chief executive of PIF. In the US case, he's claimed sovereign immunity as PIF as an agent of the state, which is the opposite of what has been claimed in England. So Richard Masters was asked how does the Premier League square it, and also whether now, with this information, so explicitly declaring itself a state entity in the US, whether the Premier League will open an investigation into the promises made by Newcastle's owners, and they are separate. And Martyn, he said it's the Premier League's policy not to comment on any investigations. They would only comment if a team is charged. However, in 2019, he went on the record to say an investigation had been opened into Manchester City over potential breaches of Premier League rules linked to the Football League documents. We know the outcome of that at the moment, 115 plus charges or whatever. So I was wondering why it's so different. The word is the rules might have changed. Martyn, do you think less transparency is better for the Premier League? Because that's the way they seem to have gone now.
Yeah, it sounds like the clubs voted through a rule change where no publicity, no announcement is given when an investigation is launched, only when charges are brought or there is a conclusion to the case. So, I mean, that, you can imagine them all voting for that, can't you?
I'm sure they are, but Ziggs, at a time when there is this also in that committee meeting, much of the conversation was about the independent regulator, and when the Premier League is trying to, as much as it can, water down the impact of a regulator on their operations, publicly reducing the amount of transparency into potential governance issues probably isn't the right way to go.
No, maybe that's right. But some in the club, certainly, I've seen people reporting Everton and Manchester City saying, the reason they're facing these charges is because the Premier League is sort of running scared of the football regulator, and that the Premier League is wanting to show that it can tackle these issues by itself.
I think the biggest issue is here domestically with this issue of this fight over how much power the regulator gets. And I don't know if coming into a public forum like a select committee in Parliament and perhaps obfuscating publicly over an issue that millions of people care about probably isn't the best way, isn't the best look at this moment.
The Live Golf case, actually, there's another development in the US court this week, because the PIF and Yasser Al Rumayyan have been arguing that they shouldn't be forced to give evidence in the court because they've got diplomatic immunity, effectively. The PGA Tour has responded to this in their counterclaim, saying that PIF and Al Rumayyan have attempted to stonewall the process, and they've tried, in quotes, everything possible to duck service, i.e. appearing in court, and continue to advance meritless arguments, it says, for not giving evidence. So, that's getting increasingly tasty in the US courts.
Tariq, you've been looking further afield into China, somewhere we talked about so often in the past. It was the place dangled for players. Well, they get a big deal in China. We get Chinese investors buying your club in Europe, and you're going to be sort of mega rich, and you're going to be able to challenge for titles, as Inter Milan had when they did win Serie A. But certainly things aren't looking good, in part how much due to the pandemic, and China's zero COVID policy that shut down the country for a long period, how much due to disinterest of the top end of China in football at the moment?
It's a mix of things, but I think even before the pandemic, the signs were not good. So just to go back, 2015, it was massive. This was a policy straight from the top, from the Communist Party's Politburo almost, to lay out a 50-point plan to make China, a global force in football, which it wasn't on any level. So this meant putting thousands of creating thousands of football-specific schools, investing in this new league, sending billions of dollars outside of the league to invest in European football, and creating the Chinese Super League, which for a while was attracting huge players on massive salaries. Remember Carlos Tevez going there? This, less than 10 years on, the whole project appears to have fallen flat. A lot of that money appears wasted. The school's project doesn't look like it's got off the ground. That league that had all of those players and all those billions spent on it is a bit of a husk of itself. We're expecting it to start on April the 15th. Again, no one knows if it exactly will. A bunch of teams, including some of the biggest, have disappeared, including one that was managed by Sven-Göran Eriksson, and had players like Javier Mascherano and Ziegler. It's just a total disaster. And then on top of that, recently the Chinese FA president was arrested. Lee Tier, the former Everton player who became the manager, he's been arrested. And a bunch of other people have been arrested as well. So I think on all levels, it's been a universal catastrophe for Chinese football, but it has made a bunch of people outside of China rich.
And elsewhere in Asian football, we have seen Saudi Arabia's women's team ranked for the first time, a topic we do discuss very often. But the bigger news in Asia this week, the fate of the Under-20 World Cup, and it's been stripped from Indonesia. It was only a few days before this announcement by FIFA. They were unveiling an official song by an Indonesian group, so it showed they were seemingly certain then of the tournament still going ahead in May, but the presence of Israel was causing particular criticism in parts of Indonesia, the Bali governor not wanting the teams to be playing there, and ultimately FIFA having to strip Indonesia of the tournament, but only referencing current circumstances in the statement, not directly saying it was due to any prohibition in Israel competing, because if they had said so, then surely Indonesia's FA would have to be suspended from FIFA, which would mean their senior teams not being able to compete. Their statement did reference potential sanctions against Indonesia's FA, but have they left themselves a bit of wiggle room here to avoid bigger sanction in Indonesia?
It looks like they might have here, and again, you have to look at the relationship again between the FIFA president and that country. If you remember, following the stadium tragedy, Gianni Infantino went to Indonesia. He then attended a global summit there, I think it was the G20 there. He then pretty much allied himself with football projects in Indonesia and said he'll work with them to host events. So it's a real unravelling very quickly, and had his personal imprint on this.
I mean, the Indonesian leadership have been quite upfront about this. They said they didn't realise that Israel could potentially qualify, and that they weren't prepared to accept it once they had. So I think FIFA might be dancing around the issue about this, but I think it's fairly clear cut. It just raises questions about why it wasn't made absolutely clear to the Indonesians that they're going to have to accept everybody who qualified, even if they were sort of politically opposed to them.
Yeah, and FIFA are trying to put out the suggestion that it was due to the country not being ready and lack of stadium preparedness. That is the reason for stripping Indonesia of the tournament, but they didn't mention that in their press release, which they could easily have done. It would have cleared up any of the discussion around it.
Well, you'd have thought they wouldn't have prepared this official tournament song if the stadiums weren't ready. It sounds like they were ready to go. I mean, you'd have done a stadium tour before you put your song together, presumably.
They do like a song, don't they, these days, FIFA? Particularly Red One, the Moroccan music maestro. He even prepared a song for the FIFA Best Awards.
And actually, talking of the FIFA Best Awards, that's where we had this, which we talked about before, this Brazilian supermodel who has been appointed as an ambassador. And she's sort of come into the news again somewhat with the. It been pointed out by the former Australian women's players' Twitter account that she is not very knowledgeable about women's football at all, because she referenced the fact that she wants to go to the World Cup in Australia in June, and completely ignoring the fact that it's in July, and also being hosted by New Zealand. So I think this is yet another question. Why has FIFA decided that they want to appoint this Adriana Lima as an ambassador when she apparently is not a big fan of women's football at all?
Apparently, according to this quote, that she's not seen women play football before, so this would be the first time at the World Cup. But let's remember what her position is. It's FIFA Global Fan Ambassador. So you could say, what a perfect ambassador, someone who hasn't watched women's football before to encourage a new audience, or should the FIFA Global Fan Ambassador be someone who can actually be really engaged in the game to drive up sales? And it's now, you think, if she has got the role, she'd be most active, because she needs to be encouraging ticket sales and people to go to Australia and New Zealand. But we've seen no real activation by FIFA of her in this big position that was announced, where she was heavily promoted at the FIFA Best Awards. And as we see, Moya Dodd, former Australia women's team player, former member of the FIFA Executive Committee, she's not happy at all about this appointment.
Yeah, just remind this is what she said. It was tone deaf, the appointment, because this event is supposed to try and promote the idea of playing football and the sports accessible to women and girls. And perhaps, she said, the best ambassador for it might not be a swimsuit model, which goes to perhaps other stereotypes.
FIFA never far out of the news or out of that scrutiny, but that about brings an end to this week's episode of Sport Unlocked. Thank you everyone for listening, particularly those in India, and look forward to highlighting some of our global listeners as we shoot up the charts. As ever, if you hit subscribe, we'll land in the feed automatically. You can also message us at Sport Unlocked on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. But for now, goodbye.